This video was brought to you by Skillshare. Hello friends, my name is JJ. So on July 17th, 1995, my 11th birthday, my parents obeyed my orders and bought me this, the Super Nintendo game Earthbound. It became a big part of my life, and you could argue is even part of my origin story into how I became the beloved full-time internet personality I am today. Earthbound fandom was the first online community I participated in during the early days of the internet, and it was from the praise and attention that I got from making Earthbound comics and Earthbound fan art for the fan site earthbound.net that I received my first taste of what it would be like to be a professional online content creator, which in turn helped convince me that this was what I wanted to do with my life in some form or another. The point is that Earthbound is a pretty special game that has inspired a lot of sentimentality and creativity in its fans from basically the first moment they played it, and you can continue to see plenty of that inspiration continuing to course through people to this day. That said, I have not said or made anything about this game in many years, but I thought I would today, in part because lately I have found myself reflecting on it from a fresh perspective, thinking about its merits less as a game and more as a cultural object. Specifically, a cultural object with something to say about America, and how, in retrospect, Earthbound is actually a considerably worse cultural commentary on America than it often gets credit for being. So Earthbound is a role-playing game released by Nintendo of Japan in 1994 for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, a sequel to an NES game called Mother that never came out here. The gameplay is quite heavily derivative of the Dragon Warrior series, but Earthbound's big gimmick, the gimmick that supposedly distinguished it from Dragon Warrior and every other JRPG of the time, was that instead of taking place in some magical fantasy land with swords and princesses and all of that, it took place in the modern-day United States in the year 1990X. And to this day, basically every review of Earthbound will make a big fuss of the modern-day America angle, treating it rather credulously as something the game handles with great genius and insight. For example, in his 2014 book on Earthbound, author Ken Bowman states, "I don't think there's a game that embraces and satirizes America's sentimental mongrel spirit better than Earthbound. This 2014 list of the most American games of all time from GameSpot.com, meanwhile, puts Earthbound at the top, calling it an overt representation of America and a reflection of America, both the good and the bad, from an outsider's point of view." IGN went even further, declaring the game a love letter to 20th century Americana. My own take, however, is that for all of its virtues as a witty and entertaining game, and there are many, Earthbound actually does American culture quite poorly. The more I reflect back on it, in fact, the more I have to conclude that one of the single biggest failings of the game is how much it doesn't deliver on its ambition to be any sort of meaningful satire or commentary on American life and culture. At best, you could say it is a game that succeeds in spite of its rather thin and superficial American theme, rather than because of it. So let's talk about the game itself. So a big part of the reason why people like Earthbound is because its story is quite surrealist and even dreamlike. It was written by a guy called Shigesato Itoi, who apparently has one of Japan's more famously eccentric imaginations, and all of the games he's worked on reflect this. The broad plot of Earthbound is that there is this evil alien force called Gygus that has invaded the world, and these four main characters have to fight it off. Part of the surrealism of the game is that you never really get a clear picture of what Gygus is. It's just a sort of demonic spirit that corrupts different things in different ways at different times, and the four heroes have to travel all over the place to fight its ever-changing form. Much of the game is set in a country called Eagle Land, which is supposed to be a proxy for the United States, and the main hero is an Eagle Lander boy called Ness. Now, Ness, I suppose, is supposed to represent some notion of an all-American kid in the 1990s. Looking at him, how good of a job would you say they did? It's worth noting that Earthbound is one of those games where the protagonists basically never speak and have no real personalities, so a lot of our knowledge of the characters just comes down to how they look and what we're told they're into. We are told that Ness is into baseball, baseball, and in the game he uses a baseball bat as a weapon and wears baseball caps as armor. When Earthbound was imported into the US, Nintendo of America actually changed his design a bit in an attempt to make him look older and cooler to American audiences, although he still dresses like a toddler. Ness lives up in the mountains with his housewife mother, younger sister, and dog called Chibi in the original Japanese script, but King in the English translation. There is no real effort to make his family in any way believably suburban, and although tension with Ness's irrationally hostile neighbor Pokey forms the central conflict of the game, Ness doesn't really have any relationships with anyone beyond his family. Ness's father is never seen. He is so obsessed with work, he only communicates with his son by phone. This idea of the dad who has abandoned the family for the office is a very common cliche in Japan, and I would say it is kind of thoughtlessly imported here. I mean, obviously we have cliches about workaholic dads as well, but in this context, it feels a bit sheltered, as if this Japanese particularity was just assumed to be universally applicable. Ness lives in a town called Onet that has a problem with a gang called the Sharks. In absolutely no way is this used for any sort of commentary on American gangs. The Sharks are just these bizarre half-shark, half-human creatures who fight with pogo sticks and hula hoops. The shark boss fights in a big robot made of wood. This is the sort of absurdism that makes the game charming, but again, to call any of this Americana strikes me as an enormous stretch. In the second city, which is called Tucson for pun reasons, but otherwise bears no resemblance to the real-world city of Tucson, Arizona, we meet the second character, Paula, who looks like this. I would say Paula is really lazily designed. She's basically just a girl and looks like about 3 seconds of thought went into her. She wears a ribbon in her hair and uses a frying pan as a weapon. Now, I know that people are sensitive about having sexism in video games called out these days, but come on! Is a character this painfully gender normative identifiably American in any way? She strikes me as much more of an example of the sort of cutesy girly girl stuff that is so common in Japan, which obviously runs in conflict with the more spunky and rebellious female characters you tend to see in the American media. Like they did with Ness, Nintendo of America also redesigned her to make her look older and cooler, but I mean, jeez Louise, Rainbow Bright still looks edgy by comparison. The final two characters are somewhat less relevant to our discussion because they're supposed to be foreigners. Jeff is a nerdy kid who goes to a boarding school in a very vaguely European country on the other side of the world. I personally always imagined him being British, but the game doesn't really give him any cultural characteristics, so that is just unjustified headcanon on my part. And the final character is named Pooh, and he is some sort of kung fu prince from a made-up Far Eastern country called Rama, or Dalam in the English translation. It's basically just a mashup of various stereotypes of India and China. Given that Pooh is the strongest character in the game, once again, this feels like a bit of a lazy cop-out on the part of the Japanese writing team. Like, if the game cares that much about its unique American setting, why make the Ultimate Warrior some karate guy from the Far East? If it was that important for him to be a martial arts master, there are still ways they could have incorporated that into a more American frame. He could have been a satire of somebody like Bruce Lee, for instance, like an Asian immigrant who ran a downtown dojo or something. But that's the other big thing about Earthbound. It is a very funny and clever game, but it contains basically no satire at all. The action unfolds against a backdrop of a few very broadly American settings, including several American-style small towns and big cities, but almost no places or characters are explicit parodies or even mild references to real-world American things. In fact, the number of specific references to American pop culture is so incredibly small, I can probably summarize them all in like 10 seconds. There is a race of aliens called the Starmen. They are probably based on the guy from The Day the Earth Stood Still. There is a band at one point called the Tonzura Brothers, or Runaway Five in English, and the lead singers seem pretty obviously based on the Blues Brothers. And when you fight the head of the Sharks, the background music is a takeoff on the Chuck Berry song, Johnny Be Good. That's essentially it. The rest of the game is completely devoid of any specific shoutouts or parodies of American celebrities, politicians, brands, music, news events, movies, TV shows, landmarks, or anything like that. In fact, at times the game seems to go aggressively out of its way to avoid opportunities for satire. For instance, the city of Tucson is home to a deranged cult known as the Happy Happyists. Cult panic is a much bigger thing in Japan than America, so once again, this feels like a bit of a projection, but obviously America has been home to a lot of high-profile cults over the years as well, so there's no shortage of opportunities for parody here. But the Happy Happyists are not a parody of anything. They wear blue hoods and want to paint the whole world blue, which is kind of goofy, but hardly insightful. And their leader is an old man called Car Painter, who not only has an incredibly lame name, but is such a missed opportunity to be a satire of some real-life American cult leader. Like, even if they didn't change his look, they could have at least called him something like Jonesy Jim or Emron Blubber or Harry Crispa or something. Whatever this is, it is decidedly not Americana. All right, now before we dig any deeper, let us just have a quick word from today's video sponsor, Skillshare. So longtime viewers of this channel may recall that I did quite a few ads for Skillshare back in the day. And though you haven't heard me talk about them in a while, I never stopped using the site, so I'm excited to have another opportunity to endorse them today. Because you see, Skillshare is the internet's preeminent online learning hub, where you can take thousands of specialized courses on an endless array of topics, taught by all sorts of hyper-talented and competent experts. For example, sometime last year, I got it into my head that I wanted to learn how to make 3D computer graphics, a topic I knew next to nothing about. But I knew that Skillshare would have a great beginner's course on it, and of course they did. And so, whenever I have a spare moment, I have been working through a series of courses on the 3D animation program Blender, as taught by this cool guy from Indonesia with 2 decades of experience in digital art. He is a really excellent teacher, just very calm and clear, with easy to follow lessons and assignments in the typical Skillshare way. I've been excited by how much I've learned, as I so often am with this site. In the many years I've had a subscription, I've found Skillshare to have useful courses on basically everything I'm interested in, from drawing to writing to time management to life coaching. Basically, if it's a skill that can be shared, Skillshare is the place where it's gonna happen. Sound intriguing? Well, if you are a subscriber of this channel, you can get access to your very own month-long free trial of everything Skillshare has to offer by clicking on the link in the thing below. So if you are the sort of person who is always seeking to expand their talents, why not add Skillshare to your personal toolkit? All right, so the enemies in Earthbound are famously weird, and I will give the game credit for including a handful of bad guys based on famous American cultural tropes, including a yellow taxi, an interstate highway sign, a trick-or-treater, and maybe 1 or 2 other things. The evil Manny Manny statue, which is a major plot point in the game, is clearly modeled after the Oscar statuette, although this aesthetic decision seems to be completely random, as the statue has nothing to do with movies or Hollywood or anything like that. But the vast bulk of the enemies are just animals and fantasy creatures, which, although often charming, have little about them that is particularly American. In fact, it is worth noting that as the game progresses, it moves steadily away from the Eagle Land setting altogether and starts taking the characters to increasingly fantastical places, you know, like Egyptian tombs and a dinosaur world and things of that sort. To me, at least, this signifies the game reaching the storytelling limits of the original America theme, which only makes sense. If you just treat America as a sort of generic urban, suburban locale without much cultural depth, it won't take long before you hit a ceiling of what you can do with that environment. Now, one of the things that always bugged me the most about Earthbound is the food in the game. In an admittedly fun twist on the traditional RPG conceit, in Earthbound, to recover hit points, you have the characters eat real-world foods rather than just drink healing potions or whatever. However, given the many, many iconic American foods out there, it is amazing how little they do with this premise. You can get a burger or fries or pizza, but there are no hot dogs in the game, there is no soda in the game, no donuts, no ice cream, no fried chicken. What there is, however, is a lot of boring generic stuff like cookies and juice and croissants. In fact, when they brought the game to the US, they actually had to add more American food to it, because initially Initially, they had the characters eating exotic Japanese things like yokan or monaka. And again, I just want to emphasize that despite taking place in a stylized version of America, the game contains no satire of American food brands or chains or stores at all. In fact, Earthbound doesn't even attempt to satirize the crazily consumerist nature of American food culture, something virtually every other take on American culture does. So like when you go to the burger store in Earthbound, it is just a burger store selling burgers. No goofy name, no goofy products, no silly slogans, nothing. Like I said, this is just a game of endlessly missed opportunities. Now, let me be clear. Earthbound is a lovely game. There was a reason I was such a devoted member of the Earthbound fandom as a kid. It is very funny, very charming, and very aggressively weird in a way that captures your imagination and keeps a hold on it for decades. But the reason why I am criticizing this nearly 30-year-old game that ordinarily gets nothing but praise is just to make the case that American culture is a real culture, and like any culture, it is one that the media can depict well or poorly. And I feel like some of the praise that Earthbound has historically gotten for creating such a wonderfully American fictional world reflects depressingly low standards for what constitutes meaningful Americana. I mean, in fairness, part of this might just be a lingering legacy of the era in which the game was released. Games about America were still relatively novel things in the mid-1990s, but in the decades since, we have obviously seen a large number of games that take place in a fictionalized version of the US that engage with American culture much more knowingly and competently. The Grand Theft Auto series, for instance, I think offers a rather hostile depiction of the US, but it's hard to deny it is a pretty well-informed one. There was a point-and-click adventure game released a few years ago that I really liked called Thimbleweed Park that I would call a true love letter to late 20th century Americana, while another game I played recently called Night in the Woods offers an equally humorous but also quite tender depiction of American life and culture in the current age. I am not much of a gamer though, so I would be really curious to hear some of your suggestions for a game that makes the most of its American setting, especially if it has a bit of a satirical edge to it. But the point is, even in the context of something like a video game, it is possible to get American culture right in the way that Earthbound gets it wrong. A place that is as complex and diverse and fascinating as the United States deserves nothing less.